Hi, class. I wanted to go over some information about textures and shaders and kind of dispel some information, some misinformation maybe you guys have. I'm not really sure how far along and what you guys do know and don't know. I mean, you should have already had a material lighting class. This is advanced material lighting, but I don't really know what you do or don't know. Really, you have three kind of choices, and I've kind of gone over this, in which that you can use tileable bitmaps, or you can use custom bitmaps, or use procedural textures. It's not really either or. It's that at any given time you're switching between those. So I've had some conversations with some of my online students in which that they've kind of indicated that, oh, they want to do procedural textures, because they're easy. Well, first of all, that's not a reason to do something. Just because something's easy, matter of fact, that's the reason almost not to do it. You want to do things because they're the right thing to do, not because they're the easy thing to do. And if you do procedural textures correctly, they're not easy. Okay, they're easy to do crappy procedural textures, and that's not what we want to do. So I want to take you through some things here and show you about doing how I create bitmaps and use them for textures and procedural textures. So what we have here is Lump. This is Lump. It's an old model I have. And he's got an unwrapped, some jeans that I made for him down here. And he's got his procedural texture up here on this metal plating that's on his shoulder. So I'm going to kind of go over, how that was actually created. So let's go over that. Okay, so to start off, what I did is, of course, I'm using Mental Ray, and this is in Max. So for you people using Maya, you're going to be using a Mia shader. And I still see some people doing Maya. They're not using Mental Ray, and they're not using Mia shaders. You don't want to use Fongs or Blends or Lamberts or any of those. That's the same thing as a standard shader in Max. Those are stupid shaders. Don't use them. You want to use Mental Ray shaders and use Mental Ray. Okay, so here's a Mental Ray shader that I've pulled out here, and this is just there are pre-made shaders that you can use, and that's what I pulled out. I pulled one out called Gunmetal Polished, okay, and this is what it looks like when I pulled it out, and here are its settings, and when I put them out here, I decided to alter them a little bit, so you can see here's the settings that I've altered. I wanted it to be a darker metal. I didn't want it to be as reflective as this. It was too kind of chromy, so I've come down, I've turned the glossiness down, I've turned the reflectivity down, I've turned my oblique. Oblique is like a Fresnel, which means that as the object gets at a certain angle, you'll see more reflection. So here is the default setting, and this is what I've set it at. Now, I have students all the time say, well, my metals don't look very good. Well, that's because of what you're doing or not doing. This metal doesn't look that good now anyway, and that's because that it has nothing to reflect. It only has this small environment. That's why we're putting HDR eyes in our scenes. So that's what we're doing here. In our case, I've gone in and gotten an HDR eye. Now, people do kind of weird things when I see this all the time. I don't know why my students want to go out and get, space HDR eyes. I see them get them all the time. That's a star with stars out in the sky. I mean, what you're trying to do is to mimic everyday things that you see. And on an everyday thing that we're looking at, we're not out in space and in stars, okay? We see a horizon line like trees. You don't want it straight. You want it to be broken up like this. So here is a good example of an HDRI image. And look how different it made this metal. That is the only change between here and there is this image. It's a drastic difference in making your metal look like metal. Okay, so this image is loaded in your environment slot. So in your environment slot, I'm loading a switcher. Okay, so this is a Mental Ray switcher, which allows me to load something different in the background, different in the reflection, which I kind of talked about that in one of our other videos doing the compositing. Okay, so the bitmap is loaded in here. It's loaded as a spherical dome around it, and it's put in our environment slot. Okay, and then it's going to give us a nice reflection like this. Now, this is too much reflection, okay? I don't want making this metal seem like chrome, and I really don't want it to be like chrome. So what I did is I've come in here and I blurred it. So I took the HDRI and I've gone through, as I'm using it through the through the bitmap here, I've gone in and done a small blur offset. It doesn't take very much in here. So I'm not really blurring the image as far as like taking a Photoshop or something blurring. I'm just blurring it in this slot right here as we're running it through here. We're coming in here doing a blur offset, a 0.02. And now my metal looks more like what I want, which is a kind of a reflective metal, but I don't want it to be like a mirror. Okay, straight out of the HDRI, it's going to look just way too hot and too reflective, so we're blurring a little bit. So that's looking pretty good. Okay, the next thing I want to do is I want to kind of break up this surface. Okay, so in other words, I don't want it to be totally one particular value of a shader. Okay, so one of the things that I was doing is I darkened this. Okay, so back in this shader right here, I darkened it so it's a darker metal. I have the ability that I can drop an image in here if I want to. Okay, so that's what I'm going to do is I'm going to drop a procedural texture in here to break up this surface so it's not the same all the way across the surface. Okay, so what I'm initially doing, and I always do this, and I tell you people not to use standard shaders, but I use standard shaders all the time to do tests because it's a stupid shader and it renders fast. And so basically I've taken the metal off of this for this intermediate stage, and I put a standard shader on it, and then I pulled out a procedural texture. In this specific case, I'm using smoke, and I pull it in the diffuse, and I do a render with this so that I can get the scale correctly. Okay, so it's one of the things that I see students all the time. They just have a problem with their procedural textures, and I tell them always do a standard shader with it in the diffuse to first get the scale of your pattern. And for some reason, students decide not to do it. They spend hours and hours and hours, and they can't figure out what's wrong with their stuff. And then I go over there and I sit down, and about 2 minutes, I can figure out that the scale of their procedural texture is way off. It's either really huge where you don't see anything, or it's really small. If you go through a standard shader really quick, then you can really quick get it down to the size that you want. Then you come back and use it. So that's what I have here is a standard shader with it going through there, and then I adjusted it until I got the pattern the way I want it. Okay. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to come back in, and I'm putting this back into this image slot. So once I have the procedural set, then I go put the metal back on it, and I'm going to put it into this slot, and then I'm toning it way down. I don't want it to show up very much, so you can see I've got it toned way down, so you can barely see this. It's like it's 7.48 is the percentage I have of this in here. Okay, and it's breaking up the surface really subtle. I'm going to turn it on and off right now. So look at the differences as I turn this on and off. Okay, there's it off, there's on, there's off, on, off, on. See how it's a very subtle change? That's what I want. That's another thing that students do. They want to scream the pattern at me. Everything it's kind of like cooking. We want a dash of salt and a little bit of pepper to get the right flavor. What we want is these small little changes. Students have a tendency to want to take the cap off the salt shaker and dump the whole salt shaker on it. If I can see the pattern, if it's jumping out at me and it's obvious, then it's not what I want. So you can see very subtle shift here because I'm layering this procedural texture up. Okay, so that's kind of the surface I want, but now I wanted to put some dings in it, like this had been dinged up. So I come back, and I'm using a dent procedural texture. Okay, so I'm using a dent on this, and I took it a little bit to get it to the size I wanted. And I wanted you to notice how this size is kind of shifted here. Can you see that the size of the dents over here are a little bit different than the size of the dent on this one? This is what's a problem, is that whoever initially created this piece scaled this character down, scaled this part of it down, and didn't reset the transformation. I think I've mentioned before that your objects have coordinates and your world has coordinates, and if your object and your world coordinates aren't synced, then you can have some odd things happening, and that's what's going on with this. This object has been scaled down, and then its transformation reset. This one was scaled down. It didn't have the transformation reset. So the pattern still thinks this object's really big, and that's why this pattern is bigger than these. Now, because of what I'm doing right now, it doesn't really matter. I don't really care, but in certain circumstances, this will give you a lot of problems if you don't reset your transformations. So you want to build your objects to scale. If you don't, you build them big, that's fine. Scale them down, then reset the transformations. So what the environment thinks the size of the object and what the true size of the object is the same thing. Okay, so this just has a dent in here. This dent's in the bump slot, okay, on that shader. And so we're getting this dent, okay? Now, I want to break this up because here's where a lot of people will stop. They'll just stop right there. Well, this looks like a procedural texture because it's uniform across the surface. Surfaces are not uniform. They break up. So you want to break this up. So I'm going to come in and I'm going to use dent in a couple different ways to break this surface up. I know I want a few areas with bigger dents on it, so I came back in and I've made another dent. Okay, another dent, this procedural dent, and I don't use this very much because it's not very organic, but it does have a metallic kind of thing. And since I'm doing metal, and I want it to seem like there's some pock marks on this, I don't know, like the guy's been fighting and been jabbed or something. So that's fine. Now you can see I've done a much bigger pattern on here. Okay, so I want the small pattern. And then I want the big pattern. And I'm going to merge these together, okay? So that was set at 100. This one's set at 300, which gave me a bigger pattern, okay? And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to take that original pattern, that medium pattern, but I want it to be watered down. I don't want it to be as heavy as it was before. So there's what it was before, and so I want to pull it back down. I can't pull back down the amount of bump I'm doing on it because you could do this with that, but I can't because I want the other ones to have a deeper gash into it. So I'm pretty much stuck with the amount of bump I'm putting on it. I have to just water this one down. So what I'm doing with this is I'm taking the dents, okay, and I'm running them into a mix, okay. I'm running it into a mix, and what the mix does is it brings this, and it goes into the first slot, it goes right through, and it does nothing, okay? Now, initially, this is white, and I've changed it to black, and then I've started mixing black in with it. So, in other words, you can see how this is really white and black, and now this is gray and black. So what's happening is I'm really watering down the white, and the white is what pushes it up. So basically, by running it through a mix and making this a certain percentage, when this is 0, then the dent just passes right through. It does nothing. If this was 100, then the top one would be turned completely off, and you would just be the bottom one. And so now what I'm doing is it's 80% of the bottom, only 20% of the dent, and it's really knocked it way back down, which is what I wanted, okay? So I want a small dent pattern on there. All right, the next thing I do is I'm going to use a procedural texture to break these up. So in other words, I'm going to merge the big dent with the medium-sized dent, and what I'm going to do is have to have a mask for that. Okay, now you want to be conservative in the amount of procedural textures you can use. The reason you want to do that is the more procedural textures you use, the longer it takes to render. So what I'm doing is taking this same smoke, the same smoke that I was using to break up. Okay, so it's already going to calculate this, and I'm running it through an output node. An output node is going to do what I call clamping. So in this output node, now some procedural textures have an output node and some don't, so you have to put this output node in. Like if I was using noise has an output built into it, so I don't have to put this extra node in here, but smoke doesn't. So I'm running the smoke through this, and then what I'm doing, and I've got a proxy shader back on this again because I'm just trying to get the pattern right. And then I come in here and I'm going to enable color map. Now I say clamping, that's what term we use. We don't turn on clamp. We're enabling this section by going enable color map. Then I'm putting 2 points in here. By default, this is a slant that goes across, which means all this has a nice graded angle to it. So it's very soft and marshmallow looking, which was great for my other part I wanted to use, but I wanted this to have hard edges. So I put 2 points in here, and then I'm making them straight on top of each other, and here's what it looks like. So instead of a nice gradient, which is what you get by default, it's going to have a stark edge to it. And so I'm taking this procedural texture, which has a really kind of marshmallow look, and I'm able to break it up really, really nice. And so I get a hard edge in here to do my matte with, okay? So same smoke as I'm using before, so I don't get another overhead from a different smoke, but I'm running it through an output node, and then I'm clamping, and that's going to give me my mask that I want. And then in the next video, I'm going to show you exactly how I use that. Okay, so now what I've done is I've brought that smoke in. Okay, I've gone back to my metal again. And what I'm doing is I'm taking the pattern and I'm taking that small bump, the watered down bump that I used, okay, and I'm using it in a composite, okay. So that watered down bump right here that's gone through that mix, I put in layer 1, okay, and you can see it's really grayed down, and that gave me my small little pattern in there, okay. And now I've added it going in back on top of it with a darken mode, full blown black and white, and it's given me these bigger patterns in here. Okay, so by using this output, okay, and I've given this one a little bit different pattern, what it's doing is it's blocking so that wherever it's black in this pattern, it's showing the bigger clumps, and wherever it's white, it's showing the smaller clumps. Let me turn this on a before and after. So this is with the mask on it. That's without the mask. So that's what I had. Then I'm putting the heavier on there, but see how it's only going in certain areas. Okay, and I'm not getting charged any more rendering time here because I'm using the same procedural texture. I'm just going through an output, and then I'm masking it together. So this dent is here, and the dent is here. But this one, I'm just watering it down by plating a gray with it, which is giving me a very subdued pattern, which is the small pattern in there, that pattern. And then I'm running it through this output and through a mask. So this is going through. So what I'm using a mask node, basically what that means is this pattern's going through here, and wherever this is black, it's letting the pattern go through, and wherever it's white, it's blocking the pattern out so that this other one's showing through. So now we're getting this nice kind of breakup across the surface like that. Okay, then the next thing I'm going to do is I come in here and I use the big one that I had did before, okay? And so now I'm doing the same thing again, but I've added a third tier in here. I get a third tier, and I'm using the big dent now, and that's coming into here, and that's adding some big dents on here. So let me turn this on and off. Okay, so here's a before and after. That's with the big dents, and now that's turning the big dents off. Big dents back on, the big dents back off. Okay. So let's see if I can turn this on. Okay, so there's the watered down dent, and then here's with the final dent back on top of it. So you can see it's really broken up the surface so that it looks very custom. It doesn't look like we're just sprayed a texture across it. It looks like it's being busted up and is very custom. And that's what we end up doing with Max by stacking our procedural textures and mixing them in a complex way. So procedural textures are not really simple if you really know what you're doing with them, because you're trying to make them look very lush and complex. Okay, so let's just go through this again. Okay, so there's Lump with it on his shoulder. Okay, gunmetal, HDRI, to reflective. We're going to blur it. We've got it blurred. Now we're getting more of the look that we want for our metal. Now we want to break it up with some dents on it. Okay, so we are going to break up the surface first so that it's not all one color. Okay, so we're doing a smoke on it, and then we put the smoke on there. That stained it. That's before, that's after, before and after. Subtle little things that we're adding to it. Then we come in and we're adding the dent on it. This dent's pretty big all the way across it. Looks pretty nice. It's kind of what I want. I just want to bust it up some. This dent pattern is bigger than these because this didn't have the transformation reset. Normally I'd go and do this, but in the end, this is going to be broken up so much you really won't be able to tell. Okay, then here is our big dent that we're putting on it. Okay, so we're mixing our big dent with our small dent. So this dent here, I want to water it down by running it through a mix, and so it looked like that. By running it through and mixing some black in with it, it brought it back down. Okay, then I come back in and I'm going to do a smoke with a output and clamped it so I get hard edges to use as a mix between the two, between the big and the small one. So here I have the small, and a medium mixed together using a clamp, okay, and that's breaking this apart, okay, and then the last thing I did is come back on with a big one so that it went from that medium state to get some big kind of chunks on there and breaking it up a little bit more, some bigger dings in it, a few bigger dings, and then that gives me my final piece. Okay, so this is how you use procedural textures. Okay, you're using them in such a way that it's not simple, it is complex, but I'm getting a nice look out of it, so I don't have to do mapping coordinates on this. There's really no reason at this point for me, for what I'm trying to get here, is to unwrap these and paint bitmaps with these because it's just a piece of metal. Okay, so that's how I use the procedural textures on lump here to get these metals that are all across the surface here. Okay, metals here, on these down here, it's all the same shader on there. So that's how I'm using a procedural texture. Okay, the next thing I want to go into is how I did the pants. Okay, so we're going to do an unwrap and understand how to use photo sourcing to do the pants. Okay, so now I've switched to Lump's pants here, and so here's an unwrap of Lump's pants. Okay, so I've taken those in and unwrapped those, and now I'm going to show you how I end up doing the jeans texture I have on here. So the first thing I did is come in here and I found kind of a jean pattern that I generated, and I'm putting that over the top of the pants. Okay, so you can kind of see I'm just laying them over the top of the pants. Okay, then what I want to do is I need to come in here and break these up. So what I'm doing is something that I'll tell you guys to never do. I see people using this all the time. This is difference clouds in in Photoshop. I will actually kill you if I ever see you using this. I see people using it. Matter of fact, somebody's already turned this into me as a pattern. This is a god-awful tutorial filter thing in Photoshop. Everybody and their mother's seen it. You'd never want to use this as a texture. Now, I'm using it in such a way that you can't tell I'm using it, so I'm getting by with it, okay? So this is what I'm using, but what I'm doing is using it just in a very subtle way to get a little stain on here to break this surface up, okay? So I'm not using it straight on, I'm using it, and what I'm doing is using it in blending modes, okay? What I'm doing is 36% opacity to blend that in just to start breaking this surface up. So I'm not going to use it straight out, okay? Now, the next thing I'm doing is I've gone in and found several photographs of jeans, and I've cut parts out of the jeans, okay? So what I've done is cut some back pockets out, okay, and started cutting some seams, stitching out, and I'm starting to place these where I need those, okay, to go into it, all right? Then I'm coming back in and I'm layering in some folds, okay? So these are some folds that I got off photographs of jeans. So I'm doing all kind of photo sourcing in here, and I'm putting the folds where I think they needed to be, okay? All right, so then I came back in and I repositioned the back pockets, okay? So I've repositioned those. And now I'm coming in and putting some more stitching in here. And so now I'm putting the belt around here. Now, I just cut these out in small parts and put them around here. And I didn't really stitch them in because what's going to happen is he's wearing a belt. And so it'll go over this. It'll cover a lot of this. So I didn't feel that I really needed to go in here and really make this seamless. I just need where it's going to be showing around the belt a little bit to be showing it through. So then I've laid that back in. Okay, then I came in and started putting the front pockets in. So there's the front pockets coming there, putting some more folds where your jeans normally get these folds where you're bending over. Okay. And then now I'm coming in here and putting the stitching down the sides of the pants. Okay, and then the ones on the inseam. So here's the stitching on the inseam, stitching down here. Now, even when I was placing these on here, I had to periodically save this and go back and look in Max to make sure I'm getting everything exactly where it needs to be. So it took a little bit of going back and forth and back and forth and back and forth to make sure I got everything lined the way I wanted it. And then last thing, I need to come in here and put the zipper in here. Okay, then the next thing I wanted to do is I wanted to break this up even more. It was too much of the pattern was too repetitive. So I came back in here and I'm going to break this up a little bit. So I'm throwing some on here. I'm going to show you what I'm using for this. I'm actually using some concrete. I use concrete quite a bit. So I'm using concrete, and then what I'm doing is I'm using it with a soft light blending mode. Okay. And so you'll see that it's just adding subtle variations in here. Okay. So we were talking about before. I just want subtle variations. I don't want something in my face. All right. Then I have another one in here where I wanted some breakups down here. Okay. You can see this as I turn these on and off. Very subtle things. You're layering it up. What this was some actual cracked mud, and I've actually distorted it a little bit, but it was okay for what I was using because you weren't going to be able to tell. So then I use that with a soft light at 22%. So I use different blending modes according to the look that I'm after, but a soft light, 22%. And so you can see that going on and off. And then I did one more. I wanted some stain up here at the top. So you can see that. And this was a piece of rust. And then I did a gradient on it, so it kind of faded out because I only wanted it at the top. And then I blended it in. This time I used this one as the hard light at 28%. And so that's what you got. And so the staining that I have up here, let me group these together so it's easy to turn them both on and off at the same time. There's the staining that I put back on top of it to finally get the look that I wanted. Okay. So that's how I created the look of the jeans. I'm not, when we say painting textures, that doesn't mean that I start with nothing and I paint everything. I want a kind of realistic look. Not totally realistic, it's still stylized, but a believable look was what I was after with this. Okay. So there's Lump with his jeans on. Okay, so that's what it ended up looking like. So that's how I ended up so far doing what I've got here today is, this was photo sourcing, painting the jeans, putting them back together the way I wanted, and then procedural textures on the metal. So it's not either or. It's like, well, I'm going to do everything as procedural. I'm going to do everything as painted textures. You use what needs to be used to get the look that you want for your piece. Okay? Sometimes that's painted textures. Sometimes that's procedural textures. Sometimes that's a combination of maybe some painted textures on procedural textures where you're using layering it up, tileable textures. So there's not one solution. You have to have a vision in your head of what you want it to look like and then figure out how to get it. Okay? There's different types of looks for textures. You can do super realism for textures. You can do kind of believable textures that aren't necessarily realistic, but they're believable looking. And then you can do very stylized kinds of textures, more of a cartoony kind of look or different stylized textures. I'll kind of go over that in another video and give you some examples of those. So there's lots of different ways to approach this. You just need to solve the problem as what is the best look that you can get for what you're trying to do. Not what's easiest. Don't stick to one technique or the other. We just want to do what's best to get the look that we're after. Okay, thank you very much.